My name is Carrie Merson and I work for the San Antonio River Authority, and I'm presenting to you live from my office. And I'm so glad that you joined me. I am very thankful to the Girls Inc. for the invitation to see you today. Putting on amazing programs like this is so important. I hope many young women and their families are out there taking advantage of the Girls Inc. Festival. Now I'm holding a rather large shell. Anyone wondering, where did I find a shell like this? Well, maybe at a beach. Let me tell you, a few months ago, I found out about an animal I knew nothing about. And what I learned not only surprised me, but it blew my mind. So much so that I actually felt like I had to come and talk to you about them today because they are so important. So if you give me just a second, I'm going to share my screen so that we can have a PowerPoint. Okay. So thank you again for coming. And what we're going to talk about today are freshwater mussels of the San Antonio River. And here are some very first fun facts. Freshwater mussels can live over 100 years. And they can actually help clean a river. And some of them, like the one I was holding earlier, can grow as large as a dinner plate. Here's one of our San Antonio River Authority scientists with mussels that they're studying straight out of the San Antonio River. Look at all of the different textures and characteristics, and colors and sizes, and look at how big the ones that are on the right. And those were some of the same species that I was holding. Can you believe that that actually came out of the San Antonio River? So what do you think about when you think about the San Antonio River? Shopping? Maybe the boat rides down in downtown? You might be surprised though that the San Antonio River starts near downtown, but actually travels 240 miles down to the Gulf of Mexico. And there's an endangered bird down there that relies on our fresh water, called the whooping crane. So why should we learn about these freshwater mussels? I mean, they impressed me. What makes them so important? So we're going to actually go through that today. And hopefully by the end, you'll just be as excited about freshwater mussels as I am. We're going to also learn about what threatens mussel populations today. And we're actually going to talk about how scientists, especially at the San Antonio River Authority, are working to help freshwater mussel populations. So let's think about it. What makes a mussel a mussel? And we are not talking about skeletal mussels today that move our arms and legs. We're actually talking about this organism right here. So I thought I'd start off by orienting you with its relationship to other animals. So I'd like you to take a guess. Which animals are related to freshwater mussels that are on that screen? I'm gonna give you a second here to really look at those animals. Probably guess that they're related to clams at a certain point, right? And you probably guess maybe a scallop, and those are found mostly in the oceans. Maybe you thought sea slug? Soft, right? No shell. Maybe you thought land slug? Snails have a shell. Who thought about squid? Nope. It's a relative of our freshwater mussel. Anybody raise their hand for octopus? In fact, yes. All of those animals are in the same phylum as octopus and squid and snails. It's the phylum Mollusca. So some of you are studying your kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and that's where they're related to, the freshwater mussel, which is down here. Very cool, right? So mussels actually create their own shell through secretion, and so that shell actually grows as they grow. And indeed, freshwater mussels are animals. If you were to stumble upon a mussel, you most likely see the shell, and the shell can tell you a whole lot. If it's empty, it means that the animal living inside has died, but you can still find evidence of the actual muscles, like we have our skeletal muscles. They actually have muscles that keep the shell open and closed. And so you can actually find muscle scars inside the mussel that kind of give that evidence of that. That's pretty neat, right? They eat actually by pooling water in a siphon. It's kind of like a straw, and it goes into the animal where there are some gills, where the food is actually filtered out, and it goes into their stomach, and then the filtered water leaves clean, much cleaner than it came in, and that's something to really think about, right? Here's another way to think about it. On the inside of the shell, they have organs just like a stomach and heart and kidneys, like many animals do, and you can see those. So they eat those algae and bacteria, things we can barely see or not see unless we have a microscope, and other organic material that they filter from the water. Then the cleaner, more purified water leaves. And as you can imagine, pollution might be affecting these critters because of that. They take in just anything in from the water, right, to see if it's edible. But more on that later. So this is actually a living sand shell species that actually is displaying its gills. Interesting, right? And here are many of the species you can find in the San Antonio River. So many different colors and sizes and shapes and textures and fun names. And the one I was holding earlier was a washboard, and those are the ones that get bigger than a dinner plate. We have a pistol grip and a maple leaf. I could see how it got its name, right? A pocketbook. I wonder if this one actually floats. That's very interesting. All kinds, and who would have guessed that you could find this in the San Antonio River in your own city? Now, this next part I'm going to tell you is what actually made me so excited to bring this to you today. And it's a little bit of a video. And it's okay if you can't hear it.
Freshwater mussels have an amazing life cycle that depends on fish. It begins when a male mussel releases sperm into the water, which is siphoned into the female mussel to fertilize eggs. Mussel larvae develop inside the female until they reach a parasitic stage that requires the fish to serve as a mobile nursery. The tiny mussel larvae must attach to the gills or fins of the right type of fish in order to continue growing. Some female mussels have special adaptations to attract fish close enough to receive their larvae. This mussel displays a lure that mimics a small fish, but is actually part of her own body. The lure attracts a predator fish to the mussel, increasing the chances that her offspring will be able to latch onto a suitable host. The fish host provides food for the developing mussel larvae. Within a few weeks, this parasitic stage ends, and transformed mussel larvae drop off the fish as juvenile mussels. If they land in a suitable habitat, the cycle can continue.
What did you think of that? That is what astounded me, to think that there's this relationship between freshwater mussels, all the different species, and they rely on a very specific or a very specific species of fish. And each one has its own kind of host fish. That's what I got so excited about. I wanted to learn a lot more. So there's a fun word here, and it is pronounced glaucidia. I'm going to say it one more time, glaucidia. And glaucidia are the baby mussels that they just talked about being released into the gills of the fish. So more scientifically said, though, the glaucidia are the larval stage of the fish, or I'm sorry, of the freshwater mussels. So it's kind of like when you have a butterfly and the caterpillar is kind of like the baby or the larva of the butterfly. Just like that, these glaucidia have to actually go through a metamorphosis too, and they do that in the gills of the fish. Very, very cool. Just a little bit of video here to show you them actually moving, which is very impressive if you ask me. They're under a microscope there, but you can actually see them moving. Very tiny. You can see how they can kind of hide in the gills of the fish. So just to kind of walk you through one more time, because really it is very interesting later when we talk about what our scientists are doing. The male will release the sperm into the water, and the female uses that siphon or straw that brings it into her body, and it combines it with the eggs. And then once the larva or the glaucidia are formed, they are released into the water and attached to that host fish, that very specific species of fish. And they go into the gills, and sometimes they go into the scales and latch on there. And then they are given time to metamorphosize and grow and become juveniles, a little older, before they drop off and down into the bottom of the river again, where they can grow up and mature into adults. And then they do the whole cycle all over again. Isn't that amazing? I would have never believed that. So at the San Antonio River, we talk a lot about those species that are specific to the San Antonio River. And so, for example, we have 3 really good examples up here. We've got yellow sandshell, which is a species that relies on the 2 species of gar you find in the San Antonio River. We have a 3-ridge mussel that relies specifically on the largemouth bass, the bluegill sunfish, and the green sunfish to go through its life cycle. So basically a 3-ridge could not attach itself to a gar, right? And a 3-ridge could not attach itself to a catfish and complete its life cycle, okay? And then we have our pimpleback, which also which relies on those catfish species. Isn't that incredible? So this is kind of a fun way of looking at all the different ways, strategies that a mussel that has no eyes actually will entice and have glaucidia fixate themselves on the fish. So the first method here is using a hook. So some of them, not all of them, but some of them have a hook, and that helps them kind of latch on, especially to the scales of fish. Sometimes the mussel will just detect that the right kind of fish is passing by. Here it's that sandshell with the gar. And when they detect it, they just react and release those glaucidia into the water and then onto the fish. But you did see in that video something called a mantle lure, which basically it's an area on the mussel and that displays something that mimics a fish. Kind of like when you're fishing and you're using those little plastic lures that will hopefully attract a fish to bite the lure so you can catch it, same thing. And then here's where I got very excited too. These are actually not real like bugs or small fish or anything. These are actually called, and this is a complicated, fun word, conglutinin. I'm gonna say it one more time, conglutinin. Now, what's really interesting is that though it looks like a fish, like a very young fish, it's actually a group of those larvae. It's a group of the baby mussels coming together and forming to look like a fish. And so they'll display that group to the big host fish, and the host fish will mistake it for a lure and bite onto it, and then all of the glaucidia go into the gills. It's pretty amazing. And then finally, here's a really interesting one. They'll use that lure, and some of the mussels will actually, they have some like things that look like teeth on the shells, and they'll actually latch onto the fish and push all of those glaucidia into the mouth and then across those gills, and that's when they attach. So think about that. Here's an animal that has no eyes, that has figured out how to communicate and attract those host fish. It's amazing, just amazing. And so here are some other examples of mantle lures. All right, very interesting. Here's one in motion I wanted to show you. Very cool there. Now, there are lots of benefits to freshwater mussels. They are considered ecosystem engineers for a lot of good reasons. One of the most important ones is that they help stabilize stream beds, kind of like roots do in a plant, they prevent sediment from washing away in floods. Very important there. And aquatic insects and algae use the shells as habitat space. So because they don't move too much, the algae and those aquatic insects can kind of thrive on there for a little while. They're an important food source in the food chain for raccoons and fish. And mussels actually filter out that water like we talked about when eating its food. And they clean out all of the extra algae and bacteria and other decaying materials that they find actually pretty nutritious. Now, just to show you how beneficial they are, both of those tanks that you see on their screen were with dirty water. And they put mussels in the tank on the left. And look at how they've cleaned that water. And that actually takes only 4 minutes. Isn't that astounding? Only 4 minutes to clean that tank. Now, there are threats to these freshwater mussels, as you can expect, because they are pulling all of the water through that siphon and into their gills and into their bodies. And so pollution can really threaten the freshwater mussel. And that water is becoming polluted largely after a rainstorm carries all the land pollution like pesticides, fertilizers, dog waste, litter, everything like that comes into the river, and they're having to filter it out. So too much can make them pretty sick, and it's toxic and can kill them. Too much sediment from erosion for kind of the same reasons all across the land. After a rainstorm, it's all being carried in. And if there's a lack of trees and native grasses with long roots, it can't hold all that sediment back. And so they can get covered by that sediment too. And also they're having to filter it out as well. So that's really tough on them. Makes me feel bad for them, and hopefully people will keep the land clean. So now that the San Antonio River Authority aquatic biologists know just how important those freshwater mussels are to creeks and rivers, they recently asked an important question. So backtrack a little bit to 2009, we actually did a big ecosystem restoration project on a section of the river just south of downtown called the Mission Reach. Have you been there? So an ecosystem restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Do you think that we actually found freshwater mussels in that area based on what you're seeing there? So our very curious biologists asked, could scientists reintroduce freshwater mussels to this part of the river? Right, because we didn't find any. So their first step is they actually had to go out and find where all the mussels were in the San Antonio River at a few points, all along the 240 miles, plus some of the creeks that are around here as well, all the way down. And they found them, all of the ones in green are where they did find some freshwater mussels. So they were naturally existing in our river. And then scientists had to identify the types and species that they had along that course. And so this is them in action, using their scientific methods and scuba diving over here in the river to find them. And they had to collect a lot of data, right? But now that they collected a lot of data, they know that the freshwater mussels were thriving in the river and some of the creeks. And the scientists remained curious and asked another question. Could the mussels survive reintroduction into the Mission Reach section of the San Antonio River? Right, so we know that they weren't there, probably because of the restoration before it used to be restored. It didn't look very well, and so now, is it a safe space to do that? So they'd asked that question, so they had to study it. So they went out and did a really cool study that provided a safe space for young mussels that they had collected, and they put them in some safe areas that they constructed. And the scientists placed them in with the identification number, sort of like their own name, so that they could come back periodically to see if they were surviving and growing. And guess what? They were. They did find out that they could survive the area. So now that they understood that they could survive, they are now trying to create a plan to potentially reintroduce mussels into the San Antonio River in that area. So before they introduce the mussels there in the Mission Reach section, they have to understand and discuss all of the elements that would support a healthy mussel population. right? And how exciting is that to hear that they're going to continue doing that by studying water quality and water quantity and substrate, and of course, the host fish. So I'd like you to keep in mind things that you can do to help the freshwater mussel. You can do catch and release the fish that you are fishing for, because you can put back those host fish. Do keep that land clean, and the river will stay clean, especially after a rainstorm. Help us prevent erosion by planting the right plants and trees and developing the right way. And also, if you're interested and have the iNaturalist app on your phone, you can study freshwater mussels and contribute to citizen science on a statewide scale. So now we're going to show you a little bit of a video that is going to talk about a cousin, if you will, of the freshwater mussel called a Rangia clam. Go ahead and take it away.
You might be surprised to find that from the river's headwaters in San Antonio to its mouth in the San Antonio Bay at the Gulf of Mexico is a 240-mile journey. Where the river and the bay meet is a unique area called an estuary. A healthy estuary's rich plant life and slower-moving waters can help trap the river's nutrients while filtering sediments and pollutants. The estuary's natural ecosystem service helps to create an environment with clearer and cleaner water for the life in the estuary to thrive. The estuary has a mix of fresh water from the river and salty water from the ocean. The saltier the water is, the higher its salinity. The salinity in the bay fluctuates with rainy seasons upriver, providing more fresh water into the bay, and with dry summer seasons depleting freshwater resources. The organisms are used to and depend on these fluctuations in salinity to create an ideal environment for nursing habitats for young sea life, including young fish and blue crab. Many larger animals, such as the endangered whooping crane, forage for and consume these organisms, playing a major role in keeping the food web and ecosystem balanced. At over 5 feet tall, this unique bird was nearly extinct, with drastic conservation efforts increased their numbers from 16 to nearly 300 in 2015. With such positive results in whooping crane conservation efforts, it is important that scientists and citizens understand how to continue supporting the population's recovery. Scientists do not necessarily have to be in the river to predict future outcomes in the San Antonio Bay. Scientists can use computers to model and predict what might happen with the plant and animal population when certain extreme environmental conditions occur using the Ecological Dynamic Simulation Model, or EDIS. This computer program can take and layer the data we currently have on plant and animal communities, their environmental tolerances, and population locations, in combination with environmental conditions such as salinity, temperature, and tide. Then scientists can model what might happen when environmental conditions become extreme.
Well, Sarah is using the EDIS program because it has some very unique capabilities. It is able to model this very dynamic region in the marsh, essentially the area along the edges of the bay that alternately dries out and gets flooded from tidal interactions, and it also has the ability to simulate how vegetation responds to those different factors like submergence or salinity increases.
However, it helps to delve into the past to understand how organisms in the bay respond to known events and determine if these may be good indicators of environmental conditions. Rangia clams may have unique characteristics that can give researchers insight into the health of the estuary and bay. To test their hypotheses, scientists must first locate these Rangia clams. By using scanning sonar in the water, scientists can detect areas of the Rangia clam populations. The sonar uses the same method that dolphins and submarines use. The sonar device emits a sound toward the bottom of the bay. It then bounces back in a different pattern, which is then analyzed by scientists. Rangia clam populations, or clam beds, look different than other objects in the water. Scientists will then take these Rangia clams back to the lab and determine if these little creatures can be used to unlock some mysteries in the bay's environmental history. In the lab, scientists prepare the Rangia clam specimen through proper labeling and categorization. Scientists preserve them in a special coating that prevents them from breaking and carefully dissects them to expose the inside layers of their shells. Much like scientists measuring tree rings in a tree trunk, scientists can measure the width of these clamshell layers to compare past and present findings between environmental conditions, such as temperature, and determine if these layers are useful indicators in understanding the effects of bay conditions on an ecosystem. A small width might mean high temperatures, or maybe lack of nutrients or high pollution, making the range clam an important window on how healthy bay ecosystems are maintained. While SARA scientists are using the scientific method to determine the needs of the San Antonio River and the San Antonio Bay's ecosystems, it is important for people living in the San Antonio River's watershed, from San Antonio all the way to the Bay, to do their part by keeping the land and waterways clean. Because clean land means clean water for everyone.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that very much. And, you know, the clams and the freshwater mussels, they do such a great ecosystem service for us. And we would certainly benefit to actually keep them around. So I understand we might have some questions.
We do have some questions. What are some other animals that call the San Antonio River their home that we might find surprising?
Oh goodness, that's an excellent question. So I find all of the life around the San Antonio River interesting, but something that a lot of folks don't know is that the San Antonio River kind of serves as a corridor for migratory bird species that are coming through. So twice a year, you're going to see a large population coming in all the way up from Canada, Washington, New York, and they're funneling right over the San Antonio River because all the resources that the San Antonio River Authority or the river can provide, from the seeds of the plants, you know, providing all that nutrition. Some of the fish-eating birds can eat the fish as they travel. And so I think a lot of people find that very fascinating.
A question from the chat says, are all the mussels edible?
That's a great question. And I understand that for the most part, but to find out what you can eat and what you shouldn't eat, or the decision to eat them at all, I would visit the Texas Parks and Wildlife freshwater mussel pages on their website, because they're the agency that regulates all of that. That's a good question.
Can you fish in the river?
You can fish in the river. Make sure you have a license. If you're, especially if you're an adult, make sure you have a license and understand the laws and the limits. But yes, we have a huge fish population of bass and catfish and bluegill, and I think that I see people fishing out every day. So yes, you can.
Another question from the chat asks, do they make pearls?
There are some that do. I don't believe that I'm knowledgeable of the ones here in the San Antonio River, but one of the great things that is the power of the internet right now. And I hope that everybody out there got a interest in this very special animal and will look it up, because they obviously can supply us nutrition in the right ways, and possibly provide pearls, but also they help us keep our river clean.
Somebody else asked, what is the population number?
That's a great question. So back on that data sheet, they went to very specific points along the entire river to see if they could take a sample population throughout, right? So they haven't necessarily put it through an estimate like a statistical model that would show an estimate like that I'm familiar with. But what they were able to gather are, you know, over 500 individuals and 13 different species along its length. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Someone else had a follow-up for the pearl question.
Oh, no?
Do a lot provide pearls, or do very little of them provide pearls?
I wish I knew the answer to that. That's a great kind of question to delve into because if you remember, I actually just learned about these a couple months ago, so it sounds like to me that I have a little bit more research to do as well. You know, our scientists here are understanding finally the population in the river, right? And there's always going to be more and more studies that we can do to that. And I know pearls are really beautiful and interesting, and so it's always fun to learn a little bit more about, you know, those kinds of aspects of our animals.
Well, we have no more questions, and we thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Girls Inc. Take care.